All right. It is my pleasure to call to order the Wednesday, June 4th meeting of the Freeport Planning Board. A couple minutes after 6. Nice to have some warm weather. We will dive right in with item number 1, the information exchange. And even before that, I will say, Chalmers, while I am disappointed that we will no longer have the Freeport Insider because it is a very valuable resource, I totally understand what an unbelievable commitment it has been from you.
Wow.
So I would like to publicly thank you for the work that you've put in, for being here. It is not easy even to do 1 meeting a month, or maybe
Right.
sometimes 2, or maybe sometimes 3. Maybe I've gone to 3 meetings. So to do it like every week for it's been 18 months. I have 2 years. I don't even know. But it feels like forever, and it's a really valuable resource to the town. And I hope that somehow, some part, or if we're really lucky, maybe the whole thing, but if we're, I think it would be in all of our best interest for that sort of information to be out there in the world. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for being here. Yep.
Any one of you is welcome.
I mean, yeah,
Maybe,
are you
maybe we
accepting
should-
like freelance stringers? I mean, why don't you put a stringer group together?
Take it away.
Maybe we
It's
could
super
employ-
valuable.
It is. It's
Sharon does such a great job with the meeting minutes that maybe, there could be some sort of, quasi-public partnership or something that, anyway. All right, that's that. Official item 1.1 now. Kyle, you have an update for us?
So, last project review board meeting, May 21st. Maine Golf got their site plan approved for the new driving range structure on closer to the 295 side of the golf course. So they're putting in kind of a 3-sided enclosed hitting bay structure for the driving range. They're going to come back in the future for some improvements to the parking area and clubhouse, but for now, that driving range improvement was approved at the last meeting. We had our last 2 shoreline stabilization projects go to the project review board. Both of those were approved. We had a conceptual plan meeting by Green Pest Defense on Route 1, 298 Route 1. They came forward with some plans to demo their existing space there, and they have some plans to expand their offices, a new 3,500 square foot building with parking area. So they're going to come back this month for their full finalized site plan review application. And then 31 Main Street across the street came forward for a small site plan amendment and design review application for a new patio or deck area out front and a new Main Street entranceway to that building to kind of improve access off Main Street for people walking by. So yeah, good meeting overall. Number 2, update on the comprehensive plan. So some big and good news on the comp plan front. We did hear back from the state. They found that our comp plan is consistent with the Growth Management Act. So there were some kind of recommended comments from various state departments, but there was nothing substantive there where comments had to be added or changes had to be made for it to be found consistent. So even as is, it would be consistent with under the state's finding.
So can we stay on that? Do you have more on that subject?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah,
So follow up, like next steps with that, will probably be North Star coming back to the board, most likely in July, to kind of talk about those comments from the state, as well as we've had the public comment window open. That's still open through, I think it's July 1, maybe. So they would bring any public comments forward. And then the planning board, also just kind of a reminder that the board should be reading through the plan, going through anything that, maybe hasn't, just a refresher, you didn't read through something in depth, now's a great time, because we would also kind of highlight any final board comments when we come back in July as well. With the goal being that we would have some direction where, we take all these comments that are kind of left and outstanding and give North Star direction to say, okay, go off and just implement these final few comments, and then we're good with it to come back for the planning board hearing, where you would recommend it to the council for adoption? Or are there still more substantive comments from the board, or were there things raised from the public, which maybe we need a little more time to talk through and discuss? Hopefully, where we finished and with the state finding of consistency, hopefully we're at a point where the remaining comments are fairly minor. But yeah, that's where we are. So the next step immediately would be to report back on all the comments made. And then from there, we would kind of see what we have, and we'd be able to set the rest of the timeline as far as there is a 30-day notice period for that planning board public hearing. So like, let's say in July, we came back and reported out on the comments, we could potentially be looking at the August planning board meeting for the hearing if, there was nothing majorly substantive there. So, Mitch, you have any follow-up?
A couple comments. First of all, I think everybody here would agree that we should try to keep that schedule if we can.
Yep.
So obviously, if there's too many comments and it becomes a problem, we might not make it, but that's a schedule we should try to keep.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is.
Just on that real quick, I do think if we maintain that schedule where, we're at discussion in July for some of the comments, it's at an early August public hearing with the planning board. If the council could set the public hearing in August, we could be looking at like a very early September adoption, which I think is either on pace or ahead of where we
I think
initially
October is the
Yeah.
initial schedule.
Yeah, well, that would push it
Yeah,
up
yeah.
a month or two, but that's good.
I'm not opposed to that.
That would all be good. So then the second thing is, if the public comment period is open until the first of all, it would be good if we reminded the public in every
Yep.
outbound thing we have that
Talk
it's
with-
closing the window and please look now.
Freeport Insider,
And then,
looking at you.
well, but you have a relatively small, I don't know what reach we have, but anyway, that's an important date. And then the next thing is, I don't know what the comments are from the state, may be arcane, or the comments from the public. So if we can all read it between now and, I guess our meeting is on the 2nd, is that correct?
Well, we're going to talk about that.
That's the
Yeah.
last item.
Okay, so
yes.
whenever it is then, we can all read it by then, but it would be better if we read the comments, because what if the comments come in with lots of objections that we are going to have to discuss? And so how do we make sure that that is?
Yeah, hopefully we have that in the background material leading up to it, at least whatever we have.
Yeah,
up
so
to that point.
but if it closes July 1st and the meeting's July 2nd, that's a little
If it has to be
tricky.
batched out as like, here's what we have
Yeah.
now. here's
Oh,
what
right,
we
right,
have.
you could just, that would be great.
Yeah.
And then we could read the last few comments the last day, that'd be fine.
That would be great. I think it is worth pointing out to, I know we're sort of getting ahead, but on the date of the July planning board meeting, if we were to, if we couldn't keep that July 2nd meeting, then we might run into an issue with the 30-day notice period, because we kind of can get away with it because July is a 5-week month where we could set the public hearing.
Well, if it was the 9th, well, we don't even know about the room,
But that
so.
that wouldn't work because August is the 6th, the meeting.
30 days. That-
Right, well, can we keep it on the 2nd? Is
Well,
that
that's, yeah, that's what I'm saying. That would be the ideal, as people are,
Yep.
thinking about that, is that would allow us to.
And we have a problem with the 2nd, it's the 2nd, we did that item.
Yeah.
So that's really all we have there. So good news, happy with that. We haven't gone through every single comment in depth yet, or at least I haven't. I don't think Caroline has yet. We just found out this, I think, the end of last week. So I know there were some comments from, some state departments like IF&W and things like that. So it's more recommendations, but nothing major. So
More concerned if there's public comments that all go in some direction that we're not aware of.
Item 3, update on the design review ordinance update. So a little bit of a question for the board here. So most likely, we could have a text draft version ready for the July meeting or a July meeting. That was another part of the later item about the July scheduling. So when I say text version, that would be a version without graphics at this point. And if we were going to bring a text version to the board to get some kind of preliminary feedback on the whole draft, it would be myself and Caroline presenting that, because we only have so many times with North Star coming back to the board built into the remaining budget. So our question that, we want some feedback on is, does the board think that's a valuable exercise? There's, I think, pros and cons both ways. If you're looking at just the text version, you don't have the context of some of the added photos or graphics to go along with standards. But on the other side, you'd get a first look at those standards, and if there are things in there that you think are off base or should be changed or, whatever, maybe that kind of supports the direction of some of the graphics. But also, it would be myself and Caroline bringing that forward, so, the people who actually put the ordinance draft together wouldn't be in the room as well. So we could certainly take comment and take feedback and, answer some questions, but we might not have the exact background intent of why every single standard was done the way it was. So really looking for feedback from the board, because we would most likely also notice that meeting and send notice out as we got into actually talking about the draft language. We would send notice out to the district that was happening. So thoughts, anyone, on which way they would prefer to go on that? If we didn't go that way, then I could envision maybe coming back in August with the full draft with more of the graphics and inviting North Star to make the presentation.
While we're having a public hearing on the comp plan.
Yep, so that's another part of the July scheduling is, should we have a placeholder for a second meeting in July, because we have a lot of big ticket items.
I think our eyes might be bigger than the time allowed to do a big comp plan meeting and a very important comp plan meeting, and also try to squeeze in an important.
If we had a second meeting in July, would the drawings be done? When are the drawings going to be done?
I don't know exactly.
I think part of the thought with the doing the initial meeting before the drawings are done is it's hard to predict exactly what would happen, but there's at least a chance that if we find an issue with the text where there's a direction.
They're going to waste their time making bad drawings.
Yeah,
Yep.
that we could correct, get out in front of a potential drawing
And the
issue.
basic-
And so without the certainty to know which way that's going to go, there's at least the possibility that we end up saving time overall.
Yep.
So,
And we're basically budgeted for a certain amount of drawings. So if we ran into a situation where we had drawings and then the board decided to change a standard and it was a big enough change that all of a sudden the drawing didn't make sense,
that's how you
then
end up
we
with
run
So
red
that all
lines,
makes
scribbles
perfect
on
sense, and looking at stuff early couldn't hurt. And I think you guys presenting it would probably be fine, as long as the feedback got back to North Star, and if we were
Oh, yeah.
confused, we could bring the question back.
Exactly.
Because we're obviously going to have a meeting with them once the drawings show up.
So the second,
Can I just say one more thing about the drawings? It would be helpful if there was a text version and no drawings, if they at least said what drawings were expected.
that's a good idea.
like
if
placeholders.
Placeholders of, we will have a
Drawing
drawing
here.
of this.
Yep.
Because otherwise, we don't know. And the whole point was to try to make it as graphical as possible. So I agree with you that we probably cut some things off by reading the text before the graphics, but I want to make sure the graphics are really integral and clear. And that mostly it's driven by graphics, because that's the standard is.
The most likely, Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looked, Kyle and I were looking at the calendar here a few minutes ago, and it seemed like the most likely date for a second July meeting is the 23rd, which still, because, again, as mentioned previously, it is a 5-Wednesday month. The 23rd still gives us a week before the August 6th meeting, so we don't have two.
It's still 2 weeks apart.
It's still 2 weeks apart, so we
Yeah,
still
yeah,
have,
yeah.
we don't have
Yes.
back-to-back weeks.
Well, I was going to say that the week before the 7/14 or 13, or whatever that date is, I couldn't do, but.
Yeah, so the other Wednesdays have a bit of a scheduling conflict, so the
At
9th,
the room then.
Coastal Waters is in here, the 16th, PRB is in here, the 30th, right, we're like back-to-back weeks, not preferable, so the 23rd is
That would
really,
definitely be my preference, too. I have,
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if I'd be able to make that or not.
Okay.
Beyond the, I have to check on a couple things.
yeah. Can we,
Overseas
Chance-
again?
chance
does everybody
I'm not
feel
gonna
okay?
do that.
Overseas again?
No, Frank, family can't.
Does everybody feel okay about penciling that in and maybe do a little investigation? I think it's the kind of thing, if we only had barely like, if only 4 people were here, it probably wouldn't be worth it. But if we have 5 or 6, then that probably
Is
is
that-
worth it.
What day?
It's a Wednesday.
Wednesday.
7/23,
7th?
the 23rd. of
23rd.
Yeah,
Of
23rd.
July, yeah.
And then the second.
The
of
second
July.
and
I'll get
then
that
the
one down, yeah.
23rd, and then the 6th of August.
So on the 2nd, though, everyone is
Yeah.
generally good with that one? Okay, that's good. Yeah, I mean, if for whatever reason, right, like, we want people to be involved in these discussions, even if there was technically a quorum with 4, we want most of the board to be able to kind of speak on these things. So if it turned out not a lot of people could make that 23rd meeting, I think we could just, push things off until our normal August meeting. But if it's an option and, we have the opportunity to tackle some of these things and kind of reduce the burden on some of the other meetings, then that'd be great.
It's on my calendar.
I'll check into it.
So if people who have questions just want to reach back out and let me know for sure, that'd be great. But we'll pencil it in. All right.
I think that's it.
I think that covers it because that
That covers it
takes
for
care of
item
3 and 4.
Item number 1. Item number 2 is a public hearing to discuss proposed amendments to Section 505 campgrounds of Chapter 21, the zoning ordinance regarding the clarification of the minimum land per campsite standard and other non-substantive changes. Well, actually, there is one, I think, substantive change, right, which is the reduction in the allowed area per campsite. And also non-substantive changes, so. Kyle, you want to give us a brief recap? And then as a reminder, before we do anything, Rosemary, I believe you were not here for that meeting.
The last one?
It was the last
I
month?
was here.
Oh, you were here?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. My brain is not working properly. Never mind.
Yep. So we talked about this last month. The basis for bringing this up was that we've had some site plan amendment applications for campgrounds go to the project review board. There was some, confusion or lack of clarity for the board on how they should interpret this, where, drawing kind of camp lot lines around each site, requiring each specific tent site or RV site to have the dedicated square footage, or whether it could be a net calculation. We feel, I think our code officer reached out to DEP. They're generally fine with a net calculation. We've looked at a variety of ordinances. They go both ways. The state rules don't really specify where the land you need for each site is. It doesn't specify that it has to be a dedicated kind of, lot area. It's more just you need the land on the parcel. So that's how we've worded it. We've, kind of amended the language to, instead of talking about the minimum requirement for each site, it's, kind of framed as this, the maximum allowance you have in a campground is this net calculation where you take the total net land area and divide by 1,000 square feet kind of outside of the shoreland area, which matches the state rules, or 5,000 square feet in the shoreland area, which is also in line with the state and DEP for shoreland zoning. And then we subtract out from that land area any roads, driveways, wetlands, or line below the high water line, which is consistent with how the state frames it. So it's really just meant to clarify that confusion for the project review board for those types of applications. And then in our discussion last month, the board, I think, also raised 505C, the screening standard, as being a little confusing to read. It's screening shall be required when necessary to shield the ground from non-compatible abutting areas. It didn't really specify or make clear what non-compatible areas were. So I just kind of took a stab at beefing that up a little bit. So I framed it as, newer expanded campgrounds. So anything that's coming forward from this point on, we're not going to retroactively go back and require existing campgrounds to add additional screening. But specifically, where I think this has come up in the past with some of our existing campgrounds is the board has put in extra buffering requirements when part of the campground abuts, a single-family home or something like that. That seems like the primary thing that we would run into here in the RR1 zone, where a lot of the campgrounds are. You have largely a single-family home district with, the occasional use like a campground or something like that. But leaving it flexible enough where the project review board, if there was another use taking place that required some screening, there's still room for that. But then instead of just kind of leaving it general with screening, we referenced our existing buffering and screening standards in section 506 of the zoning ordinance, so tying it directly to that. So happy to answer any questions or take any feedback. But if the board was ready to recommend this to council this evening, there is a proposed motion and some supporting comp plan points in the staff memo.
Does anybody have thoughts on this or
Fine with me.
anything to go over?
The way
we-
it's written, I don't have any issue with it.
Didn't we talk it through? I feel like we
I thought-
talked it
yeah.
through and
Talked it
we
through.
agreed, and we
Yeah.
just need to make sure that public okay, we're done.
So I do have one sort of thought about this, and to lay my cards on the table. I'm not going to stand in the way of this necessarily, but I think when we were talking about reducing the minimum area from, I believe it was 5,000 previously, down to 1,000 when it's outside of the shoreline area, the question came up, what are we trying to protect or what are we worried about? And generally speaking, the thought was we should let campground owners make choices about campgrounds and let the market sort of dictate what is a good campground. I could not articulate any sort of rebuttal to that. That makes perfect sense, and it still does to me largely. However, campgrounds are in the rural zone, and I think we have certainly heard as part of the comprehensive plan update a strong desire to maintain the rural character of the town. And I think the current comp plan, the 2011 comp plan, would support that as well. I think the one concern I would have is a dense campground in a rural area could, in some world, have a lot of traffic and noise implications for abutting rural parcels. Now, that's
Where are campgrounds allowed, though?
In the rural, in the
There-
R1.
Throughout the rural zone, you could make.
Pretty much anything.
Anything could become campground after campground after
So it would
campground.
still be subject to site plan review, and so there is a chance that the project review board could say, hey, your traffic stand, you're not managing your traffic
don't
appropriately or
have much
something, but
basis
they don't,
to
right,
do
exactly.
that.
So it seems like a relatively far-fetched and sort of weak protection if that is something that we want to be concerned about. So that was kind of one thing that it didn't come to me in the meeting, or at least not in a way that I could articulate. But I think it is at least worth considering for a moment whether that change will impact, maybe it's just a symbolic change. Maybe nobody would actually do like 1,000 square feet per campground anyway.
And would it much matter to the abutting neighbors if it was 1,000 or 3,000?
I think it could.
Probably.
I think it could matter. I mean,
It
if
would
you imagine
matter.
So I
Lower the
think,
Density.
I think too,
Yeah.
It's a
I
density
mean,
issue.
traffic,
It's a
on
density
traffic,
issue.
noise, it's still noisy. You could have a noisy,
it
just
depends on
increases the
the
likelihood.
parcel as well. Some of our existing campgrounds are on, right, like massive parcels. Like I was just looking at Wolf's Neck, there are a few parcels there, but one where a lot of the campgrounds are, and it's at least 40 acres. So with the 5,000 square feet, I mean, they could theoretically have, like 300 campsites, and they don't have that
Right.
many right now. Versus, I think last meeting, the gentleman from Cedar Haven was here, and, it's a little tighter of a parcel, and he was talking about if the number was lower, it could have allowed a few more, and he was trying to push that maximum limit. So I do think it depends on the
Right.
parcel involved where.
And I think
well,
I think the scenario, you always have to, I guess, there's the danger of going down the rabbit hole, but I think in general, we want to think about what is sort of the more extreme, maybe not the most extreme case, but a more extreme case of, say it's a minimum legal lot in a rural zone, so it's 2.5 acres. So that's roughly what, like
100,000,
120,000 square feet.
43,560.
you could
Right.
technically
100,000 square feet,
put
yeah.
100
Many sites?
100
100
sites
sites.
on 2.5 acres.
2.5 acres.
1,000 acres a site. 1,000 acres per
1,000
site.
acres a site,
1,000
2
feet,
acres
yeah.
is 86 or so.
But that's if you can, like he said the other night, like he said, Crooked said the other night, it all depends on what you're renting to.
Right.
You're doing
But I-
pushers and Class As, you end up
But
with a
that's not, I mean, I think my point is
couple thousand square feet to just get them to
Right.
move around.
But
And you got to
if
take
you-
out the roads and everything else. And
if somebody's goal were to maximize tent sites, just for like in 5 years, all of a sudden the latest craze is let's go tenting with our friends. And so everybody's coming to Freeport to tent, and there's 100 tents on your neighbor's parcel that's 2.5 acres, and they're all crammed up, and they go, because they're so tight, they're right around, so they're right up against the buffer, and the buffer, honestly, not gonna do all that much.
So there
That's-
is a 50-foot setback in the
Yeah.
rural zone, so that would be.
But
the kind
that's,
of
you know,
distance
here to the
property. Yep.
desk. I mean, when you've got somebody drinking in a tent, it's not that far.
but is that really going to happen?
So that's I don't think I think the likelihood. I mean, it's all about likelihoods, right? So if you increase the theoretical number of campsites by 5x, that means you also increase the possibility of a disrespectful, loud camper by 5x. I don't think we're going to get that extreme case, but we also are talking about a 5x change. So we are going from 5,000 square feet
So
down to 1,000 square feet. So if there's a 50% chance of this happening, 10% chance, I don't know. But I think all of the work that we do here is a balance of landowner private property rights and the private property rights of abutters. I mean, that's, it's a taking from one in service of another. So it gave me pause on my drive home.
Can I go down
and
a rabbit hole, inside your rabbit hole, which has to do with downzoning? And so I don't know what, if any, rights we ever have to downzone anything. But here we are trying to protect the rural value land. We're promising the universe that we're gonna get denser downtown, but we're gonna protect that. And what if someday we decided we didn't want it to be 2.5 acres, we want it to be 5 acres? Or what if someday we decided we didn't want to allow any more campgrounds? Could we, or could we not? Because if we could, then I'd say, worry about it if and when it happens. We could always, stop it then.
Yeah, and there could be.
I mean, you'd lose the first one, of course.
Right, exactly.
But,
That's and we've used that sort of line of reasoning on a lot of stuff in the past, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable necessarily.
But do we even have a right to down? Could we ever take?
You could change that standard,
Could we
anytime.
take rural residential and make it 5 acres instead of 2.5?
You might want to wear your pitchfork armor.
Yeah, I mean, there's already
I'm
loads
not saying we should or could. I just want to know, do we have a right?
There's already loads of non-conform, right, at some point it was made 2.5 acres. Loads of lots in the RR1 right now don't have 2.5 acres. So those were all made non-conforming at the time of introducing that lot size. So, yeah, the town could decide to increase the lot size.
You just would have to allow what exists to be non-conforming, but
legally
Legally non-conforming,
Right.
that which comes with certain things. You can expand a certain
from
amount.
then on, you couldn't take a 40-acre parcel and divide it into 2.5s. You'd have to divide it into 5s.
Yep. Just like if this campground ordinance was amended and a campground based on that 1,000 square foot density went forward and it was a mistake and the board changed it back, that campground could continue to
course.
exist, but then going forward, you'd be back where you were.
And if they, for some reason, decided they wanted to pave over or tear out the campsites and become a restaurant for a year and then change their mind, they couldn't go back because they'd have to get a new site plan, which would no longer be
What
allowed.
do you guys think?
I think it's fine I think it's fine what we did. I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, same here. I get your point, Sam, but I think the likelihood of going from 5,000 to 1,000 causing a problem is very small because you could have a loud, obnoxious group on a 5,000 square foot.
Right, and I don't disagree with that point. I think maybe my entire worldview is based in probabilities, and so I'm just sort of running, and I'm not great at math or anything, but I'm running this sort of loose calculation in my head that says, all right, well, now it's 5 times more likely if.
Well, we've never had a problem at all, so 5 times a very, very low number is still maybe
Yep.
insignificant.
Fair point. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think there's any problem with what we're doing. I mean, what do we got, 5 campgrounds in town?
How much more demand is there really?
That's right. I think, the people up there to the desert road up there, they just want to add a couple, and they're getting a fight with all the neighbors. So I don't think we have to worry about them putting in one every 1,000 square feet or something, I mean, it's, it's not one of my concerns that keep me up at night, so.
Yeah, it should be, this, bringing it up, the reduction was, we were already in here for this change. Looking at the state rules, the 1,000 square feet was in the state licensing rules. This wasn't based off of some potential proposal of a
It comes
campground
from the
looking to
state,
come in,
right.
and
It's just
maximize their
matching.
density, yeah.
And the other thing is the party in interest who was here last time and saw what we decided would be surprised if we reversed it at this point, I think. And he's not here for
I
the
don't think,
public hearing.
I'm not proposing necessarily reversing. I would more be inclined to split the difference or something like that.
And there were, in looking at what other towns were doing, there were places that did 2,000, 2,500 square. I mean, you could see the full range of 1,000 to 5,000, so.
Yep. All right. As I said, I will not stand in the way of the vote. Any other comments?
Thought it was an interesting moral dilemma.
It was.
Yeah. Generally try to stay away from like the philosophical conversations, but at some point.
No,
you get
this
sort
is
of round-
exactly
It is,
right.
though.
I appreciate
Yeah,
you.
I think
That's what we're here
it's-
for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally.
It's it is at some level, like much of life, a philosophical
Yeah.
question. So, okay, somebody want to take a stab at a motion?
Is the
Who's
motion
got the
here?
cheat sheet?
It
I think
is.
Kyle did
That
give
is-
us
Yes,
a
it
pretty.
is. It's here.
It's on page 2 of the staff.
It's right
report.
here.
Staff report. Great. I'd be happy to. Proposed motion, be it ordered that the Freeport Planning Board recommend to the Town Council that the zoning text amendment to Chapter 21 zoning ordinance regarding amendments to Section 505 campgrounds to clarify the land per campsite requirement and campground screening standard is consistent with the Town of Freeport Comprehensive Plan.
Second?
In
And
that,
then-
hold on.
Shouldn't it
hold on.
also say?
In that,
In that, Freeport will continue to be a desirable place to live by protecting natural historic resources, maintaining large tracts of undeveloped fields and forests, and providing opportunities to enjoy these places. That Freeport would be responsible stewards of the environment by providing incentive to develop land in ways that don't harm the environment, protecting environmental sensitive areas, that Freeport's economy would remain strong and stable by promoting Freeport as a destination to visitors, providing a diversity of commercial enterprises.
we've heard a second already, I believe,
Second?
from Andrew. All in favor? I'm actually gonna, I think for the first time ever, not vote
Just
in
not
favor of
vote.
that.
Okay.
And just for the record, I wouldn't have stood in the way of it, but since there's 5 of you over there, I feel like I can take my symbolic
Yeah.
no vote on that.
Could I just ask one dumb question about the motion wording, and I realize we've already gone past it, but aren't they supposed to say that recommends to the town council to be approved? It doesn't mention what happens now.
Recommend to the town councils that
Oh.
zoning
That's in the
text-
first line.
I did
Oh,
see that.
recommend to the town
To the town
council that it's consistent,
Oh,
Yeah.
but it doesn't say that they should adopt it.
Well, your finding is
it's consistent and
with
does
the
it. Okay.
comprehensive plan.
That's
Yeah,
all.
that's
Thank
what
you.
the planning board's really charged with, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, great. So that will move forward. By and large, I think a good change.
It's all right to be the one no vote. I've done it before.
I know. I'm not gonna lose any
I've been
sleep
there
over it. I
too.
feel like I have to, like, I've been doing this long enough now that once in my sort of planning board career, right, I have
It's a
to.
noble spot, don't worry.
Vote no, you could have voted no. So you-
I did, I think.
Oh.
Yeah, I
Oh,
meant to
wasn't-
anyway. I didn't, I guess I didn't do a
thought-
roll
I wasn't
call.
sure if it was an abstain.
No, no,
or-
I'll,
Right, that's a
Sharon, let
no
the record
from the
show
chair.
that I voted no.
I've got it.
Okay. But only on that one thing. The rest of it was great. Item number 3 is a discussion of Section 602 site plan review of the zoning ordinance regarding the need to streamline and clarify the site plan review process. Town planning staff will review and has reviewed the existing process and highlighted areas for possible improvement. Thank you, Kyle, for your in-depth staff report. Do you want to add any additional color to what you've written here? I think it's great and a great start, and I think hopefully everybody's psyched to dive into this because it's long been an area of.
So I had a presentation to go over it, just so, I mean, I think it's a important exercise, since this board doesn't work in site plan review a lot, and, you know, because of the unique kind of scenario where we have the 2 boards, just to give the planning board some background overview of the site plan process. And so, I mean, this is sort of like an abbreviated version to just, you know, go through the memo and talk about some of these things, and if there's questions that come up, you know, we can go through it. But the general idea here is to, yeah, it's just get some background info, familiarity with the board on where we currently are, and highlight some things to start exploring further if there's that desire.
So Kyle, is this when you pass it out, this is the existing one it says right now, right?
Yeah.
This isn't with any of your recommendation or
Correct.
highlights at all, and yeah, I didn't
Yep.
see any.
No red
That's
lines.
just existing ordinance for context.
So do you have one that's marked up with your highlights, or?
So that's what I'm saying. So we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay,
So right
okay.
now, what I outlined in the memo, what's here in the presentation, is just some areas basically that I've called out for concern. That, you know, you'll see at the end when I talk about next steps, we need to take a deep dive into some best practice research, look at every site plan ordinance in every community is a little bit different, so everyone handles it a little differently. In the other places I've worked, there's some similarities to what we do here, and there's some differences. So I don't think there's just one way for us to go about some of these. It'll be kind of taking our existing process and figuring out what works for us. So there's going to be a period where we need to go back, do some research, collect some options for some of these areas of concern, and then talk about what makes the most sense, with this board, and then potentially getting feedback from the project review board as well. Since they would be the ones using it, I assume that the planning board would, want their way in. So, yeah, we are not quite at the red line draft proposed changes yet. All right. So, yeah, I'm going to outline the Section 602 purpose, what it does, some of the, this call for improvement, where did this sort of stem from, our current procedural, our current process for site plan review applications, what a typical application process looks like. Some of these areas that staff has identified that are probably some of the key areas that we could use improvement in, and then some next steps. So 602 is our site plan review ordinance. This is really the key way in which we review development applications at the project review board. So, right, the project review board primarily is site plan applications and subdivision applications. Site plan applications are for things, like multifamily housing, commercial developments, and then smaller scale, site plan amendments could be things like changes of use or building or parking area additions, things like that. This section of the ordinance goes over everything to do with this. So it's the process, it's the submission requirements for applicants, and it's the review criteria and standards for the board. So basically all of the parties involved in the application are all using this section. And those standards for review are in addition to all of the other performance standards in our ordinance. So like take campgrounds, for instance, like the campgrounds fall under that section 505, which is the performance standards for campgrounds, but a campground would also, need a site plan application and have to meet all of the general site plan criteria, for stormwater and traffic and all that stuff.
It's helpful. Sometimes I forget about the findings that have
Yep.
to be made for site plan review, and
Yep.
it's helpful to see it all laid out.
Yeah, so all those performance standards really in the zoning ordinance aim to support the standards and criteria that the project review board has to make. So when the project review board is making a finding out of 602 on off-street parking, they're using the language in the site plan review ordinance on off-street parking, but it's also tying to our, section 514 off-street parking performance standards, which outlines, your minimum parking requirements and travel aisle widths and all that. So this, kind of need stems from a couple different places. I mean, one, there's just kind of general staff. I mean, since I've been here, I think I've sort of noticed a couple of these things anyway. But it's supported by some of the other work that the town's done. So the downtown vision plan recommended streamlining the permitting process to make the development process quicker and more predictable. So, we're already taking a stab at that with the design review update. The dog bone work group report also focused on this a bit, simplify site plan review and enact appropriate changes to reduce redundancy and add efficiency. So this, making things more predictable, making things more efficient. The idea here with this sort of thing is that land uses that require site plan review in whatever zoning district they're in are permitted uses. The idea is that, yeah, the review should be more substantial than just needing a building permit, but in general, if it's something that meets the standards of the ordinance, then it's allowed. It's not a subjective decision, although, there are places in our ordinances where things become a bit subjective sometimes. But
That's for sure.
in general, the idea is, you meet the parking requirement, your application says you have enough parking, you're good on that. The finding should be in favor. So the goal of some of the things we're going to be looking at is, with keeping this in mind, is that, we're not trying to get rid of review to let things go through that shouldn't, but are there areas that things could be cleaned up and clarified? Because I think the wording more predictable is good, right? Like a lot of times when staff meets with developers up front, they want predictability, they want to have an expectation. It doesn't always necessarily mean that they need everything done tomorrow, but being able to relay an expectation up front in those early conversations is really helpful at setting the expectation and getting people comfortable with the process. Where we run into problems is when, like with our current design review ordinance, it's very vague and subjective. Someone asks like, well, do you think, this will meet the standards? And as staff, it's really hard to say sometimes because they're so vague and
The
open-ended.
word compatible.
Yeah. It's like, well, it depends on who you ask. So,
And even beyond that, it seems like you said, the biggest need is for a developer to come in, understand a map of the process, and then be able to plot where they are on it, rather than have these big sort of voids that they might fall into along the way, where who knows how many meetings that's going to take.
yeah, so the goal of, kind of what I'm envisioning isn't necessarily that we're going to, peel back layer and layer of things. Like we could end up, similar to design review, it could end up being a longer document because it clarifies things that aren't currently clarified, and they're just sort of open-ended and non-specific. But with the goal of overall, all parties involved having a better understanding of the process and making it easier to manage and work through.
Is it fair to say, it seems like it's possible, at least in theory, that today, under this ordinance today, or this section today, the ideal project could move through on a timeline that might even be faster than a proposed timeline that we end up with? It's just that the goal would be to end up with a timeline that's much more consistent. So you narrow the, if you were to plot the amount of time that projects take on a graph, you might have some that go through in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and some that take months. And so rather than try to make everything go faster, it's to try to pick a reasonable spot and then make everything consistent so that the spread between the shortest and longest project of a sort of standard-ish type is consistent or more consistent.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to try to increase like the length of time
Right.
it takes.
But if by sort of allowing for more predictability, certain timelines have to expand to allow a better review within a more predictable window, that should be okay.
Yeah.
I guess is my. I probably
Yeah,
could have
the
just said
idea
that
is-
from the beginning, but that's the sort of the predictability is potentially even more important than the speed.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what, I highlighted on some of it is, there's some problems when we get a bunch of applications all at one time, and the way things are currently laid out, and they're just sort of, it comes in and it's tossed on the agenda, and, okay, is there adequate review time to give valuable feedback? Is there, are all staff weighing in a, concise, upfront manner to get applicants their feedback in one concise document, that they can just address at one time versus this piecemeal back and forth that we have sometimes now under the current system. It's not great for staff. It's not great for applicants. So, yeah, I think, we'll get to it later, but part of it could be, whereas right now we give people a deadline, a submission deadline, and we get all of our applications in right on that submission deadline, right? You don't have to do it on the submission deadline. You can get it to us in advance, so we have some more time, but that's not realistically what happens. So, I've been in other places where there's more of, and it's even in our subdivision ordinance right now for the subdivision process, it's worded this way, where it's more of a rolling window where you receive applications and you just review and, you give comments, the applicant addresses it, you go back and forth until you determine, all right, here's a complete application, now we're going to schedule it for the agenda, which, right, it can lead to a little more back and forth up front, but, once you have that completeness determination, things can potentially go smoother, and there's a cleaner record of, all right, your application was found to be complete.
so,
in your riddle.
I mean, that just seems very obvious. Like, I'm wondering, is there any why that wouldn't be so now, that you don't schedule until the staff says it's complete, you work with the staff to get it complete?
Yeah, and that's why, we'll get to it on it's just not clear. Right now, the ordinance doesn't give, on one hand.
That's what leads to bad meetings.
Yeah, and it's generally what we do, but there's no formal completeness letter given. The ordinance in one sentence says, that staff won't put something on the agenda until it's determined complete, but then in the next sentence it says the project review board is determining completeness. So it's kind of all over the place. It's just not clear, and that's kind of what I want to clean up and get to.
Sort of helping applicants in a way, because
Totally
theoretically,
helping.
you could have, I mean, as a developer who understands the process and understands the importance of the completeness finding, whereas somebody who's just saying, oh, this deadline's here, we just gotta go, and then
And
doesn't
then they
realize.
come to this meeting in this room, and they tell them that it's not complete.
Right.
We're not going to look,
And you
have
could
these
say, well,
things-
that's their problem. However, if we can clarify and make it clear to them that
That's exactly what scares people off and makes people go nuts.
Well, and it's messy the way that we have it sometimes, where things come in 3 weeks before the meeting. So we're sending out application for comment to staff departments, our peer review engineer, and, we're getting those comments. People need some time to look at that. Everyone's got other things that they're doing. They're not just looking at that one application, especially when we reach out for feedback from other departments. So that could take a week and a half to get those comments back. We also have to, send out a butters notice like we do here with the board. We're posting the agendas. We're sending out materials the Thursday before the meeting. And it becomes, really, there's oftentimes that 1 week before the meeting starts where staff is saying, okay, here's the comments back. Now you have 2 days to address those and get us back to revised materials, because we're really trying to make sure that you have everything in so the board can make a decision at the meeting. So it can be a stressful and hectic kind of situation for staff, and then therefore the applicants as they're trying to rush to get things in. And then, the board could be seeing new things right up until the meeting, which isn't great, versus having that completeness letter, all the back and forth kind of written out and established on there, and then, done that way. So we'll get back to more on that, but so general process right now, we have the pre-application meeting. This is right now staff and developer. It's very informal currently, the way it's worded in the ordinance. But then from here, we go into more on the applicant side. They put together their application. They reach out for questions on certain things typically, and they work towards putting that together. Larger projects, then go to their concept plan meeting, where, the whole idea here is these aren't engineered plans. It's kind of just even though oftentimes they are, because the engineer is already working on the project, so they typically have a site plan. But they're not bringing everything for the final application. They're not bringing the stormwater calculations and traffic analysis and all that stuff. But this gives a chance, and I do think this is a valuable step in some cases, where the project review board abutters are noticed, so you hear that early feedback from people if there is any. Whereas, I've been in the opposite situation where applications just get put on an agenda and a decision is made at that one meeting, and community members feel like they never had a chance to see things or a chance to look at anything, and they feel like it's rushed and things are happening, behind closed doors. And so there is value in that, but I think as we'll get to, there's hopefully there could be a little better balancing there. Application submission. So after the concept plan meeting, the applicant finishes up, all their engineering work and, sort of the more technical aspects of the application. That's when they'll resubmit. Staff then reviews all those materials, sends it out to the various town departments, and then lets the applicant know if there's any kind of feedback, comments, areas where they need to improve the application. So then the applicant will follow up with their supplemental materials, and that's, again, typically kind of leading right up to that project review board meeting. And then it kind of finalizes with ideally, this is sort of a typical scenario that we would see. It ends with that final meeting from the PRB. So typically, right now, for a site plan review application, let's take, what we just talked about with the main golf project that was just reviewed, or this green pest application that's in front of the board right now. This is kind of the process that we'll see. It goes to a concept meeting. There's kind of a brief preliminary conversation, 20-minute conversation with the board. They go back, either at the next meeting or the meeting after. They're presenting their final materials, and at that point it's generally approved, maybe with some conditions of approval. So it's not so much that the current process has a bad end result. It's just not always the cleanest as it could be, I think, getting there. All right, so a little more depth on the pre-app meeting. Right now, the ordinance language is pretty vague. It uses should instead of shall, so there's no obligation to hold this meeting. It's a little unclear, who's making that determination. Is it staff? I mean, there's no penalty if it doesn't happen. So, what if an applicant, says, no, I don't want to do that?
How many times does that happen?
An applicant saying that?
Yeah.
None typically, but there's no reason for it to be worded the way it is in the ordinance. It doesn't provide.
I was just wondering if you were changing should to shall because people are refusing
no.
to have the meeting.
No, it doesn't typically happen. I don't think the way it's worded adds any value or real
And
flexibility.
might they schedule that meeting sooner and quicker when they see they need to do it?
Yeah, I
How about a
mean,
must? How
Yeah,
about
shall.
must?
Shall is must.
Shall is must?
Well, the state, it's either shall or it's either permissive or it's not.
Shall is must.
and then right now there's no required submission
Shall do
materials. So, which is probably fine on small projects. But as we're going to talk about, this kind of ties into the whole concept plan meeting. And is there a way, if part of this making this process more efficient and timely is trying to get to a place where we have projects of a certain size go to the project review board once instead of twice? Is there a way to beef up this section, the pre-app meeting, where they can just, stop by whenever and talk to staff, and then, not have to go through the conceptual stage meeting?
I would certainly be in favor of increasing the threshold such that maybe there are certain projects that are big enough that they should take 2 PRB meetings, or where at least there could be value there. But I think for a lot, 2,000 square feet of new impervious area is not very much. I think that could be a bigger threshold, and we could probably capture a lot of small to mid-sized projects that should be allowed to move through in one meeting, obviously assuming they meet the standards.
Yep. So for instance, the AEC building addition, you see, I think they just started work recently. That's right in that vein. They had like a
But they had to have 2 meetings with the project review board.
Yep, because it
That
was
was
like
after they
a,
let us-
it was like a 1,500 square foot building addition and then, or 2,000 square foot building addition and then like another 1,000 square foot parking addition.
So
So that's a
I'm
perfect
first
example.
having trouble, I mean, I have trouble even understanding the role of the project review board, because if things either meet or don't meet the standard, and if they meet the standard, they're approved, if they don't meet the standard, they're not approved. So now my question is, in that concept meeting, what is being discussed? I mean,
It
what's
allows,
the?
PRB just allows it to be very subjective, I think.
I've been in
Why-
the room
why-
when the PRB denied a conceptual approval and made them come back for another conceptual meeting before proceeding to the final meeting.
So they may have a very different opinion, and as you said up front, we would, treasure, we need to have their input. But if you say it meets it, if you work with them and say, this is what the standard says, we're going to go back and forth until you have an application that I believe meets the standard, and then you schedule their review, and I don't even know why you need to schedule their review, because you just said it meets the standard, it should be done.
There are things there are standards that leave up to the authority of the project review board.
They're really not standard, so.
No, there are things like our parking requirement in commercial districts. There's no established parking minimum in the C1 and C3 and C4. The way it says is the applicant provides a.
But the PRB could
parking
arbitrarily
analysis.
come up with, it's not enough parking based on that?
So the applicant provides a parking analysis, and the PRB is the one who determines if it's acceptable, and they can.
That's illegal.
But I think you have to, I mean, there has to be a record, right? Like somebody has to create a record
Yeah,
for,
and
I mean,
it's-
this is like,
It's why we've taken a number of things to the staff review board over the years, and before I got here, a lot of smaller, every municipality in Maine has a planning board that, or most of them, a planning board that reviews site plan applications. Freeport isn't unique in that aspect.
we would have to change like the foundations of town
The way-
government to do away with,
PRB, yeah.
PRB's not that old. I mean, the planning board did it for years.
right,
Was
but I
it
think
15 years ago, 20 years ago, they split it off?
But the change was made to allow for more time for the planning board to do the long-range stuff, like the comp
Well,
plan.
that's also when the Freeport was just, growing at leaps and bounds, but,
But just the process in general, like most, larger communities will have a similar process, and it's to invite public engagement, under some basis that these
A
projects.
similar process, meaning 2 meetings with the review
A lot of
board.
places do. A lot of places have 2. A lot of places have 1. You can find both. I think that's one of the things I want to explore.
If you set it up with 1, they could always say, no, come back.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I touch on.
But why not come with all your ducks in a row, because you already said their ducks are in a row?
Yeah, so we'll get to that. Yeah.
And I think there is a certain view that it's a feature, not a bug, that a community can have some say about the projects that happen.
Right.
I'm not, I think I would have subscribed to that view more fully maybe 5 years ago. And now I think maybe the pendulum has swung too far in giving too few people say over what happens. Because the practice of it doesn't always match the wording of the regulation. And so I think maybe it's time to swing that pendulum back to the middle somewhere. But I mean, and maybe there's even a time in the future where we get the submission or the need for the PRB review process to move quickly enough that it could be absorbed back into the planning board. I mean, that would be great in some ways, because it would eliminate the sort of back and forth of like, oh, we should see how the PRB feels about this. If the planning board were doing both, that would be great. But that's long range.
I'd really like to fall back on the fact that, I still remember years ago, the court case in Yarmouth, and the law court decided the applicant should be able to understand what he needs to do to pass or fail by reading the ordinance. And when you come up with these subjective, and I never know I don't think that's ever been overturned. I don't think anybody's challenged anything like that since, but it's still, as far as I know, what the law court came down with in 2 cases in the state of Maine, and the applicant had to have to be able to read the ordinance and say, okay, if I do this, I pass. And all this subjective stuff just drives, I'm sure, the applicant and everybody crazy. And if it's a little bit longer and it's clearer, I don't mind. But I think the applicant should be able to come to a pre-application meeting, sit down with Kyle or whoever the staff person is, and he says, okay, I've gone down this, I've ticked off all these items, and I'm ready to go. And you either say yes or no, you got one more item, or we need a little better description here. And, you know, I mean, the community's already had input because the community's helped design the zoning, helped design the comprehensive plan.
That's why the room is so full at these meetings.
That's right, that's right. They're so happy with it. But, you know, I mean, well, they must be because they don't come and complain. But, you know, but you think about it, I mean, I'm still a landowner's rights guy, and as long as my neighbor's not over my line and not polluting my air, within reason, I think he's got a right to do what he wants to do.
I'll say largely that is how things happen a lot of time, right? Like, so.
Except for next door over here. I mean, you know.
A lot of the time. So, you know, as staff, you know, we put together a report based on the ordinance and the standards. You know, we're able to talk with applicants ahead of time, you know, yep, you know, looks like you meet a bunch of these standards. You know, we write that in the report. The board references the report, you know, stormwater findings and, you know, all of the setbacks and the space and bulk stuff and all the things that are very clear. And most of the time on, you know, these projects, the board just takes that. You know, they're not going through standard by standard, questioning what staff said or what the applicant is proposing. You know, even projects that sometimes have issues, they're by and large fine with most of the project and most of the review standards. You know, there are things that typically the board will weigh in more on if there's public comment, which is allowed as part of those applications, and, you know, there's a sensitive issue with a neighbor. You know, like as staff, we'll convey what the ordinance requires people to do. But the planning board, if, you know, an issue comes up, can, you know, has some flexibility in some places to, you know, so a lot of times typically that's the kind of role that they're
Sort of
playing.
Getting out in front of community relations.
Yeah, so
stuff.
like you talk about the campground stuff and, you know, the whole idea of buffering and screening, you know, if, you know, those buffering, it comes down a lot to buffering, you know, with lighting and traffic and noise and things like that. You know, those are things that get addressed more in the room a lot of times when there's like a known concern that comes to light, where staff might not always be able to fully address that in a pre-app meeting.
But the applicant still has to have some security through the ordinance.
Yep.
Then
And
he's
that's-
not going to get blown off just because somebody doesn't like what's going on next door and he fits the ordinance.
Yep. So, yeah.
That's
why-
always my concern is,
Yep.
who do we bend to, you know? I mean, what about the rights of the applicant? He's a landowner too.
So, I want to continue on.
Yep.
I get everyone's thoughts, though. So, yeah. So, is there, you know, some things to explore with the pre-app meeting? You know, smaller projects kind of have that less formal meeting with planning and code. And then, you know, larger projects, you know, however we end up defining what a larger project is, you know, you invite some more people into it. Fire, public works, those sorts of things. Early on, because fire especially is a big one. So with, you know, as we think about more multifamily housing projects, you know, fire code is not something on my radar a lot of times. And a lot of times those things aren't even addressed through the site plan process, but it might fall under some other process. So getting that feedback in early for the applicants is big. So just making sure it's solidified that on those larger projects, we get.
But the PRB isn't looking at building code.
They're not looking at building code, but they could be they're looking at like things like emergency vehicle access. So, you know, there have been times when, you know, not even just here, where I've worked on other stuff, you know, fire department, you know, it comes in late. It's like, oh, we, you know, would have preferred 360 access around this building, and that, you know, changes the whole site design of a project. You know, knowing things like that up front could be hugely important. And then the second bullet there is, having a brief list of submission materials to allow for some context.
I'm sorry, I'm still on the same place, and you just said it again. So knowing that there'd be 360, I keep trying to figure out what could the PRB ask an applicant to do that isn't in the code? And is that okay?
So
In other words, it either is in the
emergency
ordinance.
vehicle access is a finding under 602 that the board makes, that there's adequate emergency access.
And it's
So-
nowhere defined what adequate is?
Well, so that's why, it relies on comments from the fire department and the fire chief. So if, they say, there's some fire code or, there's some question there.
I think it comes back to me, the sort of feature versus bug of this, where, sure, maybe there's a perfect world in which everything could be codified into turning radiuses, radii, and distance
It's
from
like a
nearest
catch.
intersection, and okay, if there are more than 20 cars per hour, you need to have this distance, and then the turning radius has to be this big if the road is, it could go to that level, but it would get so ridiculous that I think
This is the catch for that.
this is the way for the fire chief to be able to say, hey, I know this town, and there's that situation where there's a blind hill in a corner and so we should take more care here. And then the PRB can say, okay, that's really good input. We're going to approve your proposal or your application with the condition that you move your driveway 10 feet that way so that people have more time to stop when they're coming up over the hill and there's a fire truck parked in the middle of the road. It's like that sort of thing
Okay.
that I think is
That's helpful.
that's
Yeah.
the reason for the PRB.
Because their layout could meet parking stall dimensions, it could meet the travel aisle width, but the way it's laid out, the fire department, right, they could have a question about, the turning of the
Yeah.
truck, or,
Or-
what if, we have to get, it comes up.
Every Friday
And-
afternoon, there's a huge line at that door in town, and
You're right, it's probably not all codified.
yeah, it can't be. If it could be, it would be, hopefully.
So, so the second bullet here kind of ties into this idea of if we use the pre-app meeting to help alleviate some of the need for the conceptual plan meeting, then we would probably want to make the pre-app meeting, especially for larger projects, a little bit more of a formal process. So, right now, there are times when people just kind of stop in and say, here's my project. And we really know nothing about it going into it. So it's hard to do any sort of research in advance. And because we don't have a kind of formal process for it right now, we kind of just accept that, it's really whatever the applicants want to give us up front, that's what that pre-app meeting ends up being. Whereas we could create a kind of a small list of, all right, well, let us know kind of the scope of your project, a sketch out or, something, so a screenshot of a satellite imagery with some boxes drawn on it, just to give us a frame of reference leading up to that pre-app meeting so we can look into some things in advance and provide you with some better info. So something like that could be a useful improvement. All right, so next, the concept plan meetings. This kind of ties into what we were just talking about. Right, so the ordinance again says should here that, applications on undeveloped land or anything where you have more than 2,000 square feet of new impervious essentially should have this concept meeting. And I think it's been the practice that these applications usually do. But it's come up at the board even, on certain projects. It's like, well, okay, why did this one have to come for a concept meeting? So I think the PRB sees that too, is that in some of these projects, right, it doesn't necessarily make sense.
The concept meeting is prescribed. You have to have two. Everybody has to have those two, the concept.
If they're more than 2,000
If
square
they're
feet,
more than two, yeah.
which is very limited. I mean, for example, my neighbor recently did a parking lot expansion, and I don't know what the calculation would be. It was probably,
I forget what it was.
it's probably around 2,000 square feet of new parking lot. It was just, to solve a sort of obvious issue to anyone who was there at a busy time. It didn't really impact anything except to improve the site. And they presumably needed to come for that, conceptual
meetings.
meeting to say, hey, can we do the obvious thing here and stop people from parking on the lawn,
Right, but do they need to come for a pre-application meeting too?
Well, that's what I think, that's where I think we need to clarify I think,
It
I
seems to
would,
me that you would have almost three levels of project, small, medium, and large, and you have town planner review, staff review, and the PRB review for the three different categories. Figuring out what those categories are would be a question.
but I think it's a pre-application meeting. I mean, maybe you gotta come to town hall, but at some point, presumably, anyway, to look something up, like, it could be pretty quick and informal, and hopefully it's
I think
framed
if
in a
I
way
was
that
like Phil
it's-
thinking about a project, I would come in and just to talk and say, okay,
Yeah.
what's going on? Not, it doesn't be a formal meeting, something I want to do because I'm the applicant and I want to know what's going on in town and what to expect. And that, so I would do that, but I wouldn't necessarily prescribe that on anybody unless they're doing, some sort of a large-scale project where, I don't know, some
So I would-
threshold, maybe then there is a.
I would never envision the 2,000 square foot parking addition as, needing an in-depth pre-app meeting and a concept meeting. It would be sort of, okay, if we could get rid of those, like, let's say, and these numbers aren't anything, but like, let's say projects, between 2,000 and 5,000 or 2,000 and 10,000 square feet of new building addition or parking addition, maybe they don't need to come to the concept meeting anymore, but they have that, little bit more of a pre-app meeting or something. So they meet with staff once to go over everything they need to submit, the logistics of the meeting, because a lot of time those pre-app meetings are kind of educational as well, where staff's walking everyone through like what you need to do. But we're also talking about the project and, all right, here are the things to look out for. And then they just go to one PRB meeting.
One thing that I think would be helpful coming out of of a pre-app meeting is almost, or maybe, I don't know where, but somewhere along the line, before somebody really dives in and starts filling out an application or developing plans, it would be really helpful to have a staff finding that based on the description of the project, you need these documents and these ones are not applicable. Because if you read the building, like a site plan submission, there's a lot of stuff there that it captures a huge range of projects. And I have gotten hung up in the past looking at my house, which I don't need site plan review, but analogous like design review, sort of like, well, how could I show that? Like, I'm not really changing that. Why would I need to draw a building section? But it's required. You got to have a building section. So it's that sort of thing that like having a finding that the staff could say. Okay,
The staff could waive it.
Yeah, they could waive it, and so you wouldn't need to show up with the PRB.
Well, you may develop a checklist of all the
Yeah.
things you need and then check off the ones that that applicant
Yeah.
needs.
Well, and that's what we typically, we have the checklist. We tell people, especially on things like take a change of use, for instance, a change of use that goes to staff review board or, whatever. It's not adding any impervious area. You're not going to need to do a handful of the things that are listed here. So,
But I think that's where the
But it-
pre-app meeting is super helpful to sort of like stave off the anxiety that
Yeah.
comes with reading through these things and seeing how much you might potentially be required to.
yeah, and that's
produce.
why, we try to do that at that pre-app meeting is because, if you just blank hand someone the ordinance and the checklist, it's a mess.
One minor suggestion, since we're talking about increasing a limit, and which I, again, would totally support, I think it might be helpful to do, especially because a lot of these projects would be in the downtown area, it would be helpful to add a standard, like a percentage of lot size standard as well. Because I could see if we raise it to 5,000 square feet, well, what if you're like my house, my lot is only 10,000 square feet. If I'm doing a 4,900 foot impervious and I sneak in without any stormwater and I just dump everything onto my neighbor, like that's not really fair. You could see on a bigger lot it might be fine because the groundwater has dissipated by the time it's gotten to the boundaries. But I think that
Yeah, this-
additional layer would be helpful without really creating any extra complexity.
This comes up with the sidewalk thing as well, right? Like, 2,000 square foot project or a 5,000 square foot project, depending on the site, could be very insignificant. Like if you're talking about a 50-acre site with an existing large-scale commercial use and massive parking lot, an extra 2,000 square feet to that parking lot is not going to mean much of anything. No one's going to even notice probably. But yeah, 2,000 square feet on a 5,000 square foot lot is, could be a huge difference. So yeah, it is something we could look at. I'm not sure. I've never seen it done that way, but yeah, we can look at it. All right. Sensitive to time, so I want to keep moving. So application review timeline, we touched on this a little bit before. There's this kind of inconsistency between, it's not the job of this board to look at the PRB rules, but there's right now an inconsistency between the PRB rules and the ordinance. Not exactly sure how that came about, but it's something we'll want to kind of clarify as part of this. And as I brought up before, so right now, there's not really anything, it's confusing as to who is determining whether a application is complete, and there's really nothing in the ordinance that requires a formal completeness letter to the applicant once they receive the application. Like the ordinance kind of alludes to, a project shouldn't be on the agenda until it's found complete, but it's not really giving that responsibility or what that should look like. So that's something, I think we want to clean up. So I think there's kind of a couple ways to do this here. There's the way we talked about before where, there's this kind of rolling application window where we receive in applications as staff. Once it's determined complete, staff kind of writes up that letter, provides it to the applicant, and says, all right, you're now put on the next available PRB agenda. Or there's a way in which the PRB is the one who is making the completeness determination, but we probably want to give ourselves a little bit more than that 21 days that we currently have, where we say, all right, give us your applications, which are supposed to be, meeting all of the required submission requirements of the site plan ordinance 30 days before the meeting. Staff will go through it and let you know if anything seems to be missing, but the PRB will make that formal completeness determination as part of their, finding at the meeting. So I think communities do it in both ways. So I think it really comes down to preference. But the main thing here that I think we need to improve on is giving adequate review time and giving adequate time for applicants to respond to comments concisely and not having the piecemeal back and forth that creates confusion and is just messy, and it leads to items coming in late and being submitted to the board and things like that. So that's kind of the main point here.
So are you asking for feedback on whether it should be at the PRB or at you?
I think, you can give that feedback now. I think it's also something, this is one of the things that I want to look at, what are the majority of communities doing? Because I've done it both ways in the past.
Which do you prefer?
It's a little difficult because one community I was in had developed, we did the first option where we had that rolling window, but the review board also met twice a month. So it was a little easier to schedule meetings in a timely manner. Whereas us meeting once a month, let's say we determine a application is complete, and it turns out the PRB meeting is 2 days from now. We can't get it on the agenda because the noticing would have already had to go out. Now they're over a month until the next meeting, which is a longer wait than what they would currently have. So that would be the only downside I see to that method.
It's a matter,
Right.
it's predictability, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
I
and
mean,
that's
when
what
I mean, I was thinking that the first option is the better option myself.
Yeah.
As a developer,
I
I
think it
would
does-
so much rather work with staff than the board to know that I have it done right.
Yep. And I think it's, you know,
With respect to what they could bring up.
how I've done it in the past is, and right, the first option is how it's actually worded in the ordinance right now for the staff review board. But the project review board doesn't match what the process is for the staff review board.
I
which
think
doesn't-
matchy-matchy.
Yeah,
is
doesn't make a
great.
ton of sense.
I mean, to the extent that we can make our ordinances consistent, we've made changes like that
Yep.
plenty of
A lot,
times over the last couple of years.
It's
yeah, to
also
try
how
to-
the subdivision ordinance is
Yeah.
worded, so I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so too. I would almost say like, and then 10, I think it should be in business days and maybe even a reminder that town hall, a business week is 4 days. So maybe it's like 8 days, which gives staff 2 weeks and, you know, unless there's a holiday or something, but typically.
Okay, great. All right. Sidewalk, we just touched on this a little bit. Right now, the PRB or staff review board have the ability to schedule a site walk. We don't do this for every application. These are more infrequent than, let's say, the conceptual plan meetings. This is really if the PRB thinks there's some sensitive issue, if like, let's say a bunch of neighbors come out concerned about, you know, some nuisance being created, you know, maybe the PRB would go out on a site walk to look at the property line and where the project is proposed. And like, for instance, the golf course, they were proposing some lighting. They were actually asking for a waiver on a lighting standard. And it was, you know, not on top of 295, but relatively close to that side of the property. So the PRB did a site walk to make sure, you know, the layout of it, there wouldn't be any issues. But this is one of the areas that's a little bit challenging, setting the expectation early on with applicants, just because it's really hard for staff to say whether the PRB is going to want to do a site walk. So again, this is one of the things I don't have a real hard recommendation for at this point. It's something I would want to look into more, what other
Would
places.
you be able to, if you were doing a staff review, would you be able to have the good sense to say, you know, or to figure out to say, recommend a site walk, don't recommend a site walk?
I can recommend it.
But would the board, would
board
you, would
has
the
the
PRB
authority,
very
though.
different?
Or could we change it? So
Yeah,
that-
could we change it, or would they comply with your?
Support that or
Not
not.
sure I care, honestly. I hate to say that. But I think if the goal is really, is predictability, I think we're gonna have to take some of the early milestone setting and put it in a predictable place, which
Moment,
is.
right.
Right, which is with staff, and, you know, I would be pretty comfortable, easy for me to say, right? I would be pretty comfortable with delegating that decision to Kyle in the interest of establishing predictability. I mean, potentially like 5 weeks earlier in the process, right? I mean, if you have to wait until the board meets to make that finding.
Yeah, in other words, even before they were finished, you're going through the process with them, getting their application right. You're not gonna schedule it with PRB until you certify that it's done, but you flag, hey, the PRB ought to look at this right now, and schedule a site walk.
Yeah, totally.
Even before it's gonna be on your agenda
There's nothing
in
that says you
5
couldn't
weeks.
reach out to the
Well,
chair
and that's
of the board
kind
and-
of, yeah, where I was going. You know, if it was something, right, that, you know, it wasn't necessarily a requirement, it's probably something that, you know, right, I would want to talk to the chair to get a feel of.
Everybody develops it all.
What's that?
It's a wonder anybody comes and develops it all.
I know.
Yeah, I think to me, that's a really clear place for improvement, is to take that step and move it much earlier in the process.
But yeah, this kind of brings up the same point. It'd be really easy to just set a threshold and say projects over X, you know, need to do a sidewalk, but then it goes back to the point that a smaller scale project, right in the village could be more impactful than a larger project,
That's
somewhere
where
else.
it's, I mean, the whole point of a site walk is like local knowledge, local insight, local conditions that are very hard to capture in ordinance language. And so determining whether or not a site walk is required then falls into that same category. It's hard to determine because you don't know what the abutters or what the topography or what the, I don't know, watershed,
Yes.
like, there's so many different things that could
You know,
impact.
you gotta think about, sensitive sites, and there's a lot to think about there. It's
So,
I don't think, like, I think it can be really helpful, and I'm sure the PRB would agree with that. It can be really helpful to establish context for them in making findings to have a sidewalk. So I don't think we want to just say no more sidewalks.
I think they should be mandatory on certain larger projects, or the ones that take up that are, so much of a lot area, as you were,
yep.
So maybe there's three possibilities there. It's triggered by a big project, certain coverage, or
staff
staff,
Staff
or pre-app, the staff
instinct,
can make the
right.
finding in the pre-app, and then maybe we even put it in a stipulation that says the site walk has to be scheduled before the first meeting, and if we can't get a quorum, then too bad, there's no site walk, or something like that. I don't know. I mean, it's
Right,
like,
because then that first meeting could be a done meeting, or should be a done meeting, unless something is really weird.
Okay, great.
There needs to be some limit on site walks too. I mean, I've been to some of these projects where there's one after another, and it just goes on. Oh, can you put up another balloon? How big are the doors gonna be? And it goes on, and you have, a couple of site walks, and there's the building. Here's where I'm gonna put the corners, I mean, I think of the Casco Bay Motors garage down there. I went to 2 or 3 site walks down there, it seems like, and it was, oh my God, what do we do now? And,
now all the trucks are parked
This
outside
is where I
anyway.
wish the rules were clear, and
they really, they probably were, but people just kept wanting to have another site walk. Can we come back next month? And can you put up a bigger balloon? And where's the corner gonna be? And I need to see this, and, come on. I mean,
I'm
you gotta be able to do it in one site walk if you're paying attention.
I'm curious on that one, what other places are doing.
so you're gonna come back to us with some finding.
But you have our sort of
Yeah,
general sense,
I
I
have,
think.
yeah, I have some general recommendations there. I think that's good. I'll combine that with, taking a look at some other things and then,
So are you gonna propose us like one of these languages here, one of these papers, and you're gonna show us what your thinking language should be? That'd be a lot easier if we,
yeah.
what you're thinking. I mean, it's nice to hash it out tonight, but I'd like to see, okay,
Yep.
red line was crossing out.
Yep.
Right. So I think hopefully we've given you,
Yeah.
anything else?
The last thing, I think it's the last thing, yep. Last thing is on the town planner review. So I think I was alluded to earlier, right? There's a couple tiers of these, really small de minimis changes to site plans. So when people are just amending some small landscaping changes, or they're adding really small amounts of impervious area under 1,000 square feet, those are things that I can just sign off on. But the process to do so is not formalized at all. There's no finding or decision requirement. It's the applicant gives you a plan with the change on it, the planner initials it, and that's it. There's no application form, there's no requirement for right title or interest, there's no review timeline, it's just, there's nothing. It's less formal than a building permit
So
application.
you need this language to be cleaned up
Yeah.
to
So
help,
this is
to
just-
cover you, for one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say.
And I think it would
just
help
write what
applicants
you-
as well to,
Yeah.
have a decision
totally.
handed to them at the end saying, the town finds that,
You're good.
this proposed
Good
amendment,
to go.
meets the ordinance and, yeah.
And he can walk out the door. He doesn't have to go to PRB, does he?
Correct.
You can do that yourself.
Yeah, for these things here, I can approve these.
I would be very comfortable with having you draft what you
Oh,
want,
yeah.
and then we will help you pass it. I
Grounded in
don't,
common sense, and
Yeah.
I think we're fine.
So yeah, it'll probably take a little bit because I want to look into some of these a little more and just find out what some other places are doing. And, we talked about earlier, we have a lot of other things that we're looking at as well, but this will be something we start working on and come back with a red line in the next couple months ago.
Great.
Okay.
Just make one more comment on it. If and when you do come back with that red line and we pass it and we change it, there's a communications that should be going along with that.
Yeah, there's a
And that's
whole,
part of the urgency to do it, because we want to be able to say, we made changes.
yeah, so alongside this, right, I think there should be a number of other improvements, like, a corresponding flow chart of a simplified process.
And say, Freeport
You know.
improves its development process, makes it easier and clearer and
Put it on the
better.
website, put additional resources on the website around this area.
Have a press release.
Yeah. press
Put in the
release.
insider.
Jesus, stir up some positive,
Put it in the
stir
insider.
up some positive feedback here.
Do,
All right, I'm good on that.
Scare
Thanks.
everybody.
All right.
All right, item number 4, sorry, I've scrolled away from that screen. Yep. Is a discussion of the community vision implementation work plan regarding staff recommendations for a work plan based on goals from our many planning efforts, the downtown vision plan, the comprehensive plan, and design, I assume design review as well, and then any working groups. And I think the goal of this is to align everyone's efforts and put us on a map where we can follow the dot, right, as we move along and see where we are. Brett, spoiler alert, has done a great job putting this together, and I'm super excited about this, so. Brett.
Thanks for the warm intro, Sam. Brett Richardson, Development Director for the town. And we had the opportunity to present this last night to the town council. And as Sam said, what we're really looking to do is get alignment across the key boards and committees who are going to be moving this implementation forward to make sure that, if you can imagine like a relay race where a runner's got the baton and they're going to hand it off to the next runner, both parties need to know what's going on and be prepared for that. So this is the idea. Why a work plan now? We've got strong community consensus. Bunch of plans, everybody seems aligned on how to grow. Comprehensive plan's cruising along. Downtown Vision's got a lot of support. Climate Action Plan, all this good stuff. Community's bought into it. So the goal is to align implementation priorities across these boards, and then to put the activities in the right order, the right sequence, to make sure that they add value to each other, they build on each other, and we're tackling it in the right way. And then in addition to that, as we get through the process of updating our zoning, our processes, we want to start to send a positive signal out to the market right now. We're going to need partners to build this vision. The town can't do it alone. And so as we work through the next 6, 8, 9 months to put these pieces in place, we want the other folks that we're going to need as partners to start that thought process too. And like Andy just said, get some positive feedback out there and some good exposure for Freeport.
Explain our partners. Run down the list of you and you say, we're going to need our partners.
Private investment, public investment, state, Maine DOT, we'll get into some of that as we get into the presentation. But it's an important thing that we have an important role to play, but we need other partners to invest in Freeport as well. So 3 key ingredients that we're thinking about here. Infrastructure planning. So we have the Maine DOT Planning Partnership Initiative. The Village Corridor Initiative is what we're referring to it now. Kickoff in June on the 17th at the Performing Arts Center. A gentleman named Jeff Speck, who wrote a book called Walkable City and has a very strong reputation across the country, if not the world, on planning for the type of priorities that the community has identified. More walkability, a vibrant downtown, and we're looking at the Route 1 corridor through the Maine DOT project from roughly Maine Beer Company up through the downtown north to Mass Landing Road, so the central corridor. That infrastructure will be analyzed by DOT. They're going to look at build-out analysis to understand what kind of new development could happen within 1,000 feet of the corridor, and then design upgrades to the transportation system for the next 50 years or so to accommodate those projections, to make sure that if we want to develop as the town's identified, that we're not going to create a bunch of traffic jams, and we're going to be able to accommodate that. So infrastructure planning, dedicated funding. We're looking at a TOD TIF strategy. Freeport is well situated geographically with our bus stops and our train station to leverage transit-oriented development, which essentially means if we can build density around public transportation and walkable communities, we can help people get out of their cars, we can have good foot traffic at our commercial entities, and we can have active lifestyles like the active living plan for Freeport identified as a priority. And then finally, really what we're here for tonight is to connect the dots between these other efforts and land use, your guys' specialty, where you guys take the lead in the town, and look at what Kyle just described around site plan, but some other work coming out of the comprehensive plan, downtown vision, and dog bone work group, and thinking about the order in which to tackle those to make the biggest impact. Council endorsed this plan last night, and so we're looking for some endorsement tonight as well, so staff knows where to put energy. We can send the signal out to our partners and get some momentum going here. So again, the infrastructure, the Village Corridor Initiative, it's a partnership with DOT, 50-50 cost share, locally town-led. It really focuses on the downtown village growth area in the new comprehensive plan, as well as the village gateway growth area. So good alignment there with the comprehensive plan that is coming back from the state here in good stead. We're looking at development and infrastructure within 1,000 feet of Route 1. This is the right place to do it. This is what the downtown division identified as a reasonable walk or bike ride into our local businesses. And we want a high-functioning Route 1 and Main Street, a lot of bike ped connectivity, and then local micro transit if we can look at it. So what this initiative does is it takes the high-level visions, and we're adding engineering firm to it to make sure that as we look at the Route 1 corridor, what we come up with is buildable. It's practical, and buildable. So June 17th, mark your calendars. Funding. What you'll see there in the lower left is a graph of the existing funding streams that the town has used for upgrades in the past. And what that depicts is the fact that the destination TIF and the downtown TIF are going to expire pretty soon. So valuable funding that we need. Just as we have this community consensus on what we want to invest in, our funding sources are going to be a little dry there for a while. So we have to think about how do we build this? How do we put the resources in place at the local level? So we're looking at the Route 1 corridor, roughly Maine Beer Company up to downtown, and the optimal strategy there to leverage funding so that when we need to make investments, we have the resources to do so. And then planning and policy. Like we just talked about, what you guys talk about and lead the community on is increasing flexibility in growth areas. So enabling diverse housing types, especially on Depot Street. We'll talk about an action item for Depot Street here in just a minute. And then process improvements. We just heard some great ideas from Kyle about how to increase predictability for board, staff, and applicants. So moving forward on that. We're looking to bundle all this work together, funding, infrastructure, and land use by March of next year. That puts, by aligning these three buckets, making sure they're all in place at the same time, we'll have the resources to move forward on, we'll have the clarity on the land use and the density that invites the kind of housing that we want to have, and we'll have the infrastructure plan that we can build towards that we know can accommodate this type of development and keep the high quality environment that we all appreciate here in Freeport. So the infrastructure, the idea is the corridor build out is going to happen over the next few months. The coordinated development design, which is an analysis of that surrounding area, understanding what footprints are buildable, and then once we have an identification of those footprints, understanding what kind of utilities they might need. Is there the right place to put the sidewalk, the right place to put the trail? That's the infrastructure that makes that buildable area tie into Route 1 in a good way. And then once that's in place, then the actual design alternatives for the corridor itself will come into place. That's September through December. The funding, we're working on the strategy and the structure right now. We'll work on that through the summertime. We'll start to prepare documents and applications in dialogue with the state to make sure that we're in compliance and we're consistent and we're in good stead with them. And then we'll shoot for a real engagement with DECD, the Department of Economic and Community Development, early in 2026 in order to be in line for approvals later that spring. So this is the big topic for tonight, really. Those other two buckets have had funding, they're resourced, allocated to the council, they're moving forward. And what we want to do tonight is really kind of focus on how the planning board and the town council align priorities to get the land use in place so that we're synced up with the infrastructure and the funding. And so the first order of business that staff and some other folks who have provided input see as a great opportunity is to increase the height allowance in the Depot Street focus area. Depot Street's been identified over and over as a great place for development. We've had some activity there. We currently have some interest there. Increasing the height in a timely fashion will unlock some potential down there to make the numbers work. It's a challenging economic time. We want to make sure that we're allowing folks the greatest flexibility that they can have in order to find an investment opportunity on Depot Street. So first order of business really is to think about increasing the height allowance on Depot Street. That's important because a lot of the land use work that's been done over the last decade has really focused on the downtown. Zero land per dwelling unit, that's awesome, right? We've reduced the parking requirement. There's been a lot of work downtown. So the proposal here, to put it in context, is really to increase that height and then to sort of tie a bow around the downtown work for a while and then shift the focus south to the Village Gateway and to the Route 1 South Gateway. So increase the height on Depot Street, unlock some potential there. We just talked at great length and with good ideas about streamlining the site plan review. That's in the works. I think Kyle is shooting to have that in play by the holiday season of this year. Great discussion tonight about overhauling the design review ordinance. That's another important process to clarify and improve. Looking to have that done as well by the end of this year. Caroline, I think one of her last acts as a town planner before Kyle stepped in was to secure a grant from the DECD through the Housing Opportunity Program with resources to modernize the subdivision ordinance as well. So again, another step to just make sure that we're clear, predictable, and folks know how to interact with the ordinances. And then the good news is, the comprehensive plan is on track here to be adopted, and I think that unlocks the potential to then really look south to upzoning and creating density and flexibility in the Village Gateway and Route 1 South growth areas. So that's kind of the sequence. Council is on board with that. I think they're ready as you guys take the lead and develop these processes and proposals on zoning updates. They're ready to receive them and act on them. So we're aligning activities. And I just want to say that, endorsing this plan, Council's dedicating the necessary resources and initiating the recommended steps will send a clear and concrete signal to potential and future partners that the town is committed to build the community's vision for the downtown Village Gateway, and the Route 1 South designated growth areas.
Yeah. So I just want to add on, because I want to second, on the couple land use points, when we're talking, because, last agenda we had on there to start looking at some things to start looking at out of the comp plan. And I just want to echo what Brett was talking about, the downtown, specifically the VC1 area where we talk about so much growth. It's in a really good spot.
There's nothing to do,
most of
really,
it.
except the design ordinance and
the
Depot
height.
Street.
Yeah, so that, getting that checked off and done would be, there's not much else to do in the VC1.
Potentially parking.
Yeah.
Yeah, potentially parking.
But as far as the density and space and bulk aspect of the district itself, that's.
Assuming the design
It's really
ordinance
important.
comes through as we hope.
And there is the possibility of a couple of sort of supplemental changes to the existing design ordinance that could theoretically be made to support the height increase without taking a ton of time.
Oh, you mean if we put the height ordinance through right now, we might have to simultaneously make some changes to the current design?
It could be worth exploring.
Yeah.
Is there anything in there that would prevent or be in
Basically,
conflict?
yeah.
Well, the current design review ordinance, right, it's got it's vague and talks a lot about visual compatibility.
Right,
There's
which-
nothing specific, but,
Right,
so
so-
that says a project couldn't be approved.
Except
but-
for Depot Street.
The thinking is, if you're gonna go ahead and change the height, you might as well let people use it.
Right, you don't want it to then fall
without the
apart on a
uncertainty, right?
compatibility
Yeah,
clause.
without
Can't
the
get
uncertainty.
sucked into scale either,
Right.
Right.
So there might be
Scale's too big.
there might be a way to stave that off. Worth exploring. And again, specifically on Depot Street. Because that's the area that everybody seems to agree is
Yeah.
the best for this sort of thing.
But then after we kind of take a look at that height thing, you know, kind of as our next item, like moving out of the downtown, because I think I might have mentioned this at the last meeting, like the C1, the C3 density, right? We allow multifamily, you know, those are growth areas as well. The comp plan talks about kind of upzoning in those areas. Those areas are in a far worse shape.
Density requirements are ridiculous.
And
There can at least be some projects happening in the surrounding village districts around the VC1 right now. Like something could happen there that works on some level. The C1, the C3, if you're talking about a multifamily or mixed-use project, it's completely unfeasible
Correct.
with the current zoning.
Correct.
So working in that area could be a good,
So do you need to spend time, assuming the comp plan is rounding the corner, identifying what are the biggest changes that we should be making starting in, I mean, to get ready for October? I get it, it's
well, I think
October,
that's
but-
what this really is, you know, we can start working on the height piece now. We can bring, there's a couple questions on that I want to dive into. Did you have anything else to add, Brett, or we can go into this? So on the height piece, it's something we can jump into immediately. I think it's something better supported under the comp plan that's about to be adopted. But I think we could start pursuing it under the current comp plan as well. Basically, we'd be ready to bring a draft, at least for discussion, in July. And, you know, we could move at the board's pace. So, but one question is, you know, that I think is important, and I just want some feedback on. So the rules of order for the planning board don't require that a height increase is sent throughout the district as far as noticing goes. But would the board want to do that? So I'll leave it up to the board, but we don't.
Don't need to send it to what district? To all of VC1?
Yeah, so if we were going to make a height change in the VC1, specifically targeted at Depot Street, basically what that would look like is, you know, right now we have a 45-foot height requirement allowance in the VC1. We would add a second line to that that's, you know, said something, you know, except on Depot Street in this area, lots fronting on Depot Street. However it was worded, you know, your building height is X.
It's not spot zoning, is it? Because it's just Depot Street.
It's, you know, we have other districts that
Yep, I
do that
understand.
sort of thing.
Just asking.
So we wouldn't be obligated under our rules or state to notify everyone in the district because we're not changing an actual land use. It's just a standard. We're not moving any map lines. But, you know, if the board wanted to, you know, I think this has happened before where the board wasn't necessarily obligated to do so, but chose to notify. We
It's a
could.
funny question, because often the accusation levied against planning boards or town bodies in general is, you know, how could you do this under the cover of night? And you go back and you say, well, actually, we had these 7 public meetings where we talked about this, and it was all in broad daylight. Here's a chance to, like, actually do it under the cover, or not actually, but do it much more quietly than a lot of other changes, and do it faster as a result. But, you know, could be a relatively big change.
Well,
And
what number are we talking about here? You
So,
know, how
right now-
How tall do the developers want to build
So
down
right
there?
now, we allow 45 feet, which, you know, will like get you 4 stories. So we'd want to allow 5 stories on Depot Street because specifically, as it was called out in the downtown vision, the grade, you know, slopes down and.
Topography allows it.
Yep.
to be
So
visually-
it would be somewhere in the 55 to 60 range to enable a 5-story building. Yep.
And for context, right, we've seen heights sort of marked out on pictures of downtown before. What's the tallest gable? I think it was Under Armour. I don't know if it's still Under Armour. That big, tall, gray gable, I think it was 48 feet.
Okay.
I think. That's what I remember.
Well, and-
And the grade probably
Yeah, it's
drops
probably 20
30
feet.
feet.
Yeah, 30 feet, yeah.
So,
Shoe shops are pretty tall down there.
yeah. So, like, from Main Street, you're not going to be looking up at anything.
Yeah, no. Might be looking at the roof, but you're not gonna be looking up.
Right.
Be curious, is there any calculation what the drop is on Mill Street? From
I
Mill-
can-
From Main to,
known.
from Main to the bottom of Mill where Depot intersects?
Yeah, I can get it as
I'd be
part
cu-
of
I'd be
this
just curious
background.
to see what the drop is there.
I was interested in looking into it. I don't have it off the top of my head, though, so.
It's bigger than 10 feet.
Well, of course, but I'm just saying, is it 40 feet, is it 60 feet?
30, yeah, 30, 40.
I would guess it's somewhere in the 30 to 40-foot range.
Has it been determined that Depot is the only place where relaxed building heights will be considered?
No.
I think for now.
Yes,
For now.
that's,
I think, and it's up for conversation, but I think one of the strategies here is that there is really strong consensus on Depot Street.
So just push
So
it.
let's get that done.
are you aware of any developers who are just waiting for that change and are ready to pull the trigger on a development?
I think that there's market interest there.
But not that definite or specific?
We're prioritizing this to move quickly.
There's interest.
So I'll say that, right, like there's kind of documented support of this, right, in the vision thing. So the idea is that this is something that's already been supported by the public in the town in some capacity. So to kind of quickly be able to
Do something.
work on this, right up front as the comp plan's being adopted as a kickoff. But it doesn't mean that we can't later on visit building height in the downtown again, in 6 months or a year
I
or
mean,
whatever
well,
it is.
in the corridor, I think there's clear expectation that the building height would be addressed there as well. And in the downtown area, the only other place would be Mallet Drive. But I guess you don't want to even bring that up now.
I think in the interest of moving quickly,
Yes.
Depot Street is the one area where 60 feet has at least sort of like
People have bought
majority,
in.
majority
Right. You
level
can say
consensus.
We have a lot of cover too, just on the, the interest in housing and, assuming if this is what
Right.
the end goal here is that, then I think we've got a lot of cover from the town on this.
Okay.
Let's just go for it.
So,
Council endorsed this last night.
so the noticing question, any feedback on that piece?
Well, if you didn't notice, so typical in other changes, you would notify the entire district? Or
No, if we were-
I mean, wouldn't it just be about abutters
Well, or some near vicinity.
or some near vicinity, that's right?
We would notify the district if you were changing a use. Like, let's say,
If you were changing something that applied to the whole district, you mean?
let's say multifamily housing wasn't allowed in a zone, and now you're proposing to allow it, your rules say you would notify everyone in the district. If you're just changing
But what if you were doing that
performance standard
change?
or something?
What if you were doing exactly that change, allowing multifamily where it wasn't previously allowing, but only doing it on Depot Street? Would you still have to tell the whole neighborhood, or because it was,
Probably just because your rules don't get that specific.
the rules say if you make a land use change, you have to tell the whole district, even if it's a very circumscribed change.
Yeah, it just doesn't get that detailed.
But somehow the height doesn't?
So performance standards, things like non-use related, don't require noticing. So it'd still be a public hearing, yeah, so if you're changing a setback, if you were, changing, some other standard, a buffering requirement, or, anything that's not affecting the actual use itself.
It's still a public process. You just have a better chance of the room looking like this versus.
Right, it's not like
know.
it's not like people can't speak on it, we'd still post the agenda everywhere, and we could make social media posts, still a public hearing eventually that's getting put in the paper, I don't know.
I would suggest that we only notice what we need to notice. That's why the rules are there. I mean, this is analogous to representative democracy, not a direct democracy. We don't need cover and votes for every single thing we do within the rules.
I'm not recommending it either, I'm purely trying to get the board's
Let's
feedback.
move this thing forward.
Yeah,
Move forward.
yeah, let's go for it.
Just because Google Earth is amazing, I can tell you that the top corner of, I think it's Mill Street and Main Street is 166 feet of elevation, according to Google Earth, and the bottom corner down kind of by the train depot but still on the street is 131, so that's 35 feet.
Close, 30, 40 feet, yep.
And then the follow-up question on this one is, so it seems the board is generally supportive of the change in that range of 55 to 60. We could do a discussion in July, and if it's looking like, I guess, does the board feel comfortable looking at this and making a decision or a recommendation under the current comp plan in July or August?
I think we need to move it through in
Or
July.
waiting until September to hold the hearing?
July.
I think we need to move this as quick as we can, and we got a meeting coming right up the 2nd of July. and
Just
I
do
think
it
we
in
need to deal with
July.
it.
Okay, so do you want us to come straight with the public hearing at your July 2nd meeting for this?
You have time to,
Yeah, the change shouldn't take long, it's just, yeah.
I think my concern about it has always been that it's targeted accurately to the consensus that we've heard from the town. And assuming that it meets that, then great.
Okay,
let's do it.
great.
Let's get it over the board here.
Is that, let's do it, is that consistent with the rest of the plan and the general sequence of activities that we've laid out?
Well, the let's do it is on the Depot Street, which you just laid out as doing that first. And it is consistent with the current plan.
Well, I think
Brett's asking
Brett's referring to
for extra.
the rest of the items. So after the height change, keeping moving with the site plan changes, the design review changes.
Do you agree broadly with
Yeah, and
Brett's?
then focusing on the, commercial 1, 3 areas.
Yes,
Yep, okay. Great.
we endorse.
It's, the reason I'm
Right.
asking that question is it's really nice to sort of get endorsement that allows us to go out and start talking to people, that there is consensus on this. And in particular, at this public meeting, when we kick off this Village Corridor Initiative, one of the things that we want to promote is the fact that we've endorsed this plan collectively and that we're moving forward on it. And so as the infrastructure happens, folks who are, those partners that we need can see this coming and get their wheels turning.
Now, as a C1 guy, I hear a lot about stuff about going to the C1, and I really want to have a discussion on when we get past Maine Beer. So, we've had a lot of talk about the TOD and the district and Maine Beer up to town, what we're doing.
Is your instinct that we shouldn't forget C1 and?
No, they're talking about, moving right on down to C1, and I just want to make sure we have a discussion on what moves on down to C1. And have that as not just lumped in with, we just,
With the
all right,
gateway.
we're here right now, Maine Beer, boom, we're right to the border without a discussion.
Right.
So, that's my,
I think at the staff level, we discussed it, and we think that, roughly October to March, so a 6-month window.
yep, I just want to have some public discussion on C1 South. Been screwed over too many times down there by zoning, so I want to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. That's why we don't have, that's why.
One of
Are you
many
worried it'll
reasons
be
we
too
want you to stay on
dense
the board.
or?
No, I just, that's why we're having development problems right down there right now, because everybody pushed no development on C1 South. That's why we have 100-foot setbacks years ago and 50% lot ratio coverages, because the downtown was the premier baby, and we on the other side of town got left out. And we fought for everything that's on that list, tooth and nail, to keep what we had down there. And it still got very testy, and we still got the short end of the stick.
It sort of reminds me of the
So,
concern that we hear sometimes from the public of, we have to focus on downtown. Look, we have to focus on downtown. We should be, we shouldn't allow growth in other places until downtown is done. And I think the response, which we've alluded to here, is it's not up to us to
Right.
actually put the shovel in the ground. Like, the table is set.
Well,
So now we need to focus on other areas and let people decide and let people figure out. And it's not it's everything all at once. It's, if we know that we want a certain type of thing in a certain area, we have to allow it to flourish in more ways than just saying,
I mean, I've talked to Kyle, and I think there's a lot of ways we can tweak Route 1 South, to make it a little more favorable. I mean, it's got some geographic problems, it's got some, land size problems and stuff like that, and it's already fairly developed, but there is some ways we can tweak it down there that would encourage a little bit of growth down there, I mean, it's not like they're all 100-acre lots down there, it's just not. You and I rode up and down it, and, you know, there could be good infill down there. So,
Yep.
just want to make sure it gets
I
handled
think that's
properly.
going to be a lot of the discussion, right, from
Yeah.
October to March. and-
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of, I mean, we've talked about it, there's a lot of our complex, like overly complex ordinance writing is front and center in that district and the commercial districts with some of the performance standards that we have there, some of the, right, the weird setbacks and just like, you could tell it was an effort to
Stop.
Stop
yeah,
development.
it's like, we're saying something is allowed, but, we only want to allow it in the most specific of cases that it makes it, nearly.
Multifamily's allowed at 4 to the acre.
Well, when rent was $55 plus triple net downtown, they didn't want, those guys downtown didn't want anybody stopping down there. And I had fight after fight. They wouldn't even advertise exit 17. To get off to come to Freeport because they didn't want people driving by down there where the rents might be cheaper. Because, oh, no, get right off. We used to get off at the Falmouth toll booth. Freeport, exits 20 and 22 taped right to the door. Not exit 17. And I came to a board and sat all winter trying to get exit 17 put on the Freeport flyer. And then come spring, when we sat there and read it, I go, oh, isn't that interesting? It didn't make it again this year. So,
The only other thing I would add, Brett, just because I know we talked about it a little bit, is just that this plan, I wouldn't say it's a conservative timeline, like it will require diligent work by many people, but we did try to allow, and I say we, but really Brett, tried to allow enough space to keep our sort of typical responsiveness to applicant-driven changes if they come up. So that hopefully we can continue to do that, because I think that is important to be able to respond to somebody.
Appreciate that. One of the things that we've looked at is just staff capacity. And sort of the condition of this is that there won't be some huge uptick in applicant-driven processes. And in the event that we're lucky enough to get a bunch of development proposals, and Kyle's focused on that, we have identified potential opportunities to leverage some of the consultants who are digging into this corridor and will have their hands in there and understand intimately what's going on, the potential to perhaps, if we needed to, and there was a capacity issue, to fill that. Because the timing and keeping on the time frame is pretty important. And so we want to make sure that, everybody understands that this is about what current staff can handle on this time frame. And if we get to a point where we need to beef this up, we thought about that, and we've got some options.
Good,
So
so this,
shifting some of the technical work to somebody who's more on the strategy side now and saying, hey, while you're at it, can you just actually write that draft ordinance language or something like that?
why is it fall of 2026 that we're going to adopt this comprehensive plan?
well, 2025,
It
what?
says 2026 here.
This is the other, that's sort of the, it doesn't say that, does it?
Well, my
Because it
copy
should say
does.
March 2026 is the kind of the end
Right
point
there.
of the work plan.
We're definitely not
Yeah, that's a
adopting,
typo, obviously.
yeah, we're definitely not adopting the comp plan in
there a typo?
2026.
Yeah, there's a typo.
That one still has draft on it. So
Yeah.
the one that went to the council was a little bit tighter. But Kyle got his agenda out a little bit, he was ahead of me. So the latest version is a little tighter than that. It doesn't have
That's what I
draft.
I just thought it was a long ways out, and I'm like,
Please.
Oh, we didn't tell you? We've delayed everything for a year. Great, well, thanks for being here, Brett. I think,
so
We'll wrap it up.
we have to take a formal vote for you? You need some raise of hands, or what do you want?
I mean, the more formal it is, the easier it is to talk about, the more serious it is. So, I leave that up to you and how you guys tend to operate.
so we'd say a motion might be to approve or endorse, let's say endorse the community vision implementation work plan as written with the year update to, but otherwise as written. If somebody wants to make that motion, something like it.
The Freeport Planning Board endorses the Community Vision Implementation Work Plan as
Presented.
presented by Brett on June 4th, 2025, with the exception of editing 2025 in the policy and planning first sentence to, comprehensive plan of fall of 2026 to 2025.
Second.
Great. All in favor? Excellent.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
For all the hard work and the vision and the clarity to kind of put this all together so we can
Second.
see where we are.
Oh, we do have to ask,
I'm assuming there's no
public, right?
There's no one who wishes to address the board on non-agenda items.
I think Bonnie's online now. I guess
Bonnie's
she's just
online.
listening, but, yeah.
Hi, Bonnie. Hope everything is good in your world. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Do we have a motion to adjourn? I can't make the motion.
Motion to adjourn the meeting.
Oh, somebody, yeah. Great. All right, all in
Second.
favor?
Oh, yes, gone, bye, fun.